name is Herman Shirley. I was born in Waxahachie, Texas, on December the 2nd of 1919. My mother and father both were raised in Alabama, a little old place called Oniana. It's in Blount County, about 40 miles north of Birmingham. And we lived up Oniana. My grandfather run a general merchandise store there, so that was kind of interesting. If you didn't watch us, we got all the candy we wanted to eat. But anyway, on December the 7th of 1941, Pearl Harbor come, and first cousin of mine, Joy Bernard, she called me on Sunday, the day of the Pearl Harbor, and told me about what the Japs had done. Well, that's the first time I knew of anything, because you didn't have no television back then. You had a radio. If you didn't have the radio on, you didn't know anything about it. But I don't know, I guess probably somebody in her family or something like that maybe had a radio on, and that was one of the things. And of course, I thought the president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, I thought he was a good president at that time, because he really didn't take him long to declare war on them. And so I was satisfied with that, you know. I decided I'd just join the Marine Corps, and I went down to join it. And I had a D1 draft card because they had a draft and everybody had to sign up. I got a D1 due to the fact that my mother's dependent on them. And I went down to join the Marine Corps, and when I did that, well, they told me, so you can't join it with a D1 draft card. You have to get your mother to sign an affidavit saying she's not dependent on you no more. And so I did, and then I went down there with it, and they let me join. And the reason I joined it was because I thought, you know, that I would like to get an outfit, and I thought the Marines was one of the fightingest bunch of people that they were, and I guess they were, you know. You got a lot of publicity anyway. I was headed toward Parris Island December the 16th. I was in the Marine Corps. And Parris Island, that's where you went through boot camp. And of course, it wasn't too hard there, nothing like it is now, because they were trying to get you in through there so you could get in the war. And so then, after finishing boot camp, we went to New River, North Carolina. That is Camp Lejeune now. And we went through basic training there, and in June of 1942, we was headed for San Francisco. Of course, we made a couple of trips aboard a ship up in Chesapeake Bay. Was go ahead aboard a troop transport and take exercise on them about how you'd live on them things and how you'd get off of them and get onto a boat, and how the boat would go to the beach and one thing and another like that. So, but anyway, in June, when we headed toward San Francisco, and we got out there, well, we finally wound up on board a ship, USS Barnett, I believe it was. We went from there to New Zealand, and I don't have any dates about when we left there. I believe it was June. They said we was going to go to the Fiji Islands and have some exercise there about getting, but we got up there, well, it didn't happen because of the corals and one thing and another like that. Boats couldn't get to the beach. We landed on Guadalcanal on August the 7th, 1942. And we landed there in Higgins boats. Those are the boats that you have to climb over the side to get off of them. And so every time you landed, you got wet because the boats don't get up all the way to the beach. You get about 10 or 12 or 15 in a Higgins boat, and it's got a little bit of depth to it, you know, so you can't go all the way to the land. And we went to New Zealand and then left there. We went to was supposed to be going for another exercise. They changed their mind and said, well, they're going to Guadalcanal. Well, of course, nobody ever heard of that before. And so we went to Guadalcanal, and we landed August the 7th, 1942. When we landed on Guadalcanal, well, then, of course, our Navy wasn't as strong as the Japs' Navy. We didn't have much Navy to protect us and one thing another like that. I guess later on in the day, the Japs from Rabaul or someplace or another like that started bombing our troop transport. And so they didn't unload all the materials and supplies that we needed, so they really took off to keep from getting sunk. And so that we was there without the supplies we should have had and one thing another like that. So, of course, I don't remember too much about having to do without any food or anything like that, because we had lots of sea rations that was canned that you opened up and one thing another like that. But it went pretty good with us. I remember one day that one night, they come there and the Japanese was shelling our place there, and it was a lot of shells that were bursting up overhead, and the stuff coming down. You think, well, we're going to get burned up here, but they'd go out just before they got to the ground, and then the next morning all hell broke loose. And of course, we was in reserve, and I guess they knew about that, but I didn't. And they attacked us from the west side of our area on the beach there. It was what they call a Tenaroo River. It wasn't a river at all. It was a place where the water, when the water got up, the tide come up, it put water into the Tenaroo, and then when it went down, well, some of the water that went in there come out. And at low tide, well, you had a beach there, and during the night, or when they had a low beach, well, the Japs come up there. They killed every one of them, and somebody said they had 1,400 killed there, and later on I heard it was 1,100 killed. But the Old Breed is a book that I have, that was put out by the Marine Corps to all the men that were in the 1st Marine Division during World War II. And that said about 800 or to 900 men was killed there, the Japs. We lost, I think about 39 or 40 or something like that was killed, and 75 wounded, and one thing another like that. And we had one that got the Congressional Medal of Honor there, and later on he got an opportunity to retire, but he didn't want to, and he went over to Saipan or one of those places and got killed there. But we was in reserve, see, and you didn't have much communication back then. And I didn't know, I knew that they shelled us all night long, most of the night, with those shells and one thing another like that, and so started with the machine guns going up there on the beach and everything like that. Well, a fellow named Bassalone, I think that was his name, one that got the Congressional Medal of Honor for his thing in there. He just kept fighting, even though he was wounded and one thing another like that. But we didn't know anything about all what they'd done until the next morning. They told us, you have to go on patrol, and so we did. We went up the Tenaroo River and crossed it up there on some not Higgins boats, but those water tanks that they had thing going across there that we could go with, and his company went up there, and then they come back down the beach over there to where that those Japs were laying down there. They killed them all, so that none got away. Of course, that was their way of doing it. If you killed the commanding officer of the thing, well, they were just lost. They didn't have nobody to tell them what to do, so they just kept coming until they all got killed. We did not have no resistance whatsoever. We didn't, and we were surprised about that, I guess. We went on a patrol after we got on the island and went, and where that was, it wasn't the first day, probably the second day when we went on patrol, and we saw 2 live Japs there, but they were on a ship, on a truck that had been bombed. Well, there wasn't anything we could do about them either, you know. If we had got them off of there, what we'd do with them? We didn't have no stretchers, we couldn't carry them. We didn't have no sick bay to carry them to or anything like that, so we just left them there, you know. That's about all we could do. We didn't have no medical man with us at that time to give first aids to them. First aid wouldn't have helped them no way because they had gangrene in them, in the legs. You could tell that by looking at them. I do not ever remember being afraid. One time we got bogged. We went out on patrol one time on Guadalcanal, and we had a river there. They called it Longer River. The Longer at that time of the year didn't have no water running down into, so you just had a little stream down there going down it. I remember the company commander said, well, we're going up in the jungle, we're going up the Longer River, but we're going to go up in the jungle. Well, that didn't happen, because when you start that jungle, you ain't going nowhere. And so he said, well, we'll go up the river. So we went up the river. I don't know how far we went, but anyway, it made a little left-hand turn, and the river did. And when it did, well, we got around there, well, then the machine gun opened up on. And so there was a low place in the riverbed there that a bunch of the first platoon got in there, and then, but we were on the platoon further back, so this platoon leader, lieutenant, said, well, we'll go up on the left-hand side up there and see if we can find out where that machine gun nest is. We'll go over there and see if we can get them people out of the river down there. And so we went up there, and I don't know, I guess he must have found a trail or something. We went up that trail and we got to a place that was just about the size of this office here, and we stopped there because the machine gun opened up on us and pinned us down. And the lieutenant said, I want 3 volunteers to go up that trail there and find out where that fire's coming from. 2 men jumped up, and I looked over at that lieutenant, and he gave me that hand to go, hit him, boy. And so I got up and went right behind Deebling Sea Corps, and they got hit right in front of me, and I didn't. I decided this is time to put it in reverse. And I come back down there, and the lieutenant said, what happened to Deebling Sea Corps? I said, they got hit. Well, he said, let's get out of here, and so we did. We got out. We went back to that's when we went back to the area that we stayed in, and there was 29 men that didn't come back. And we had a lot of men on Guadalcanal that got the malaria, and my brother Carvin was one of them. Carvin was a mess sergeant for A Company, and I was in Baker Company. I remember one time seeing a bunch of Jap airplanes coming over, and I counted them, and I think there was 24 of them there that I counted them. And We went to Melbourne, Australia. We stayed there 9 months. It took 9 months to replace a lot of the men that had malaria. And this fellow that wrote that autobiography I got, he was one of them that was a replacement. But then after we stayed there 9 months, and when we left there, we went to Good Enough Island. That was in the New Guinea bunch. The Japs had tried to take New Guinea. They took some of it, I think, but they bombed us one time while we was there. I didn't think that we was in the war zone, but we did. We got credit for that. And after we was there for a little while, we landed on Cape Gloucester. That was, I think, maybe in the Gilbert Islands. And we landed on there December the 25th of 1943. And it took about 5 months to secure that place. You'd think as many campaigns that went through that you'd say, well, that dude is bound to seeing a bunch of Japs. But I didn't see but 3 live Japs in all the war. And 2 of them was on that truck on the Guadalcanal. The other one was on Cape Gloucester. He had give up. He wanted to surrender because he had got his degree in a university in California. So he knew about living in the United States, so he was ready to give up if he could find some way of doing it. And Cape Gloucester was a place that I didn't see much action in there because I had gone to message center as a runner for Baker Company. And of course, one of the things is on Guadalcanal, Baker Company was up on the front line, and one night they got in a firefight with who? Nobody, but they firing, you know, and I think they had the wires stretched out of there and some cans tied on it, and they all started rattling. There was time to start the fire, and of course they were running out of flares, and they called up there and said they needed somebody to bring flares up there, and I had to carry them up there. And they told me before I left, and I said, you're going to have a long trip up there, and you ain't got you know the way? And I said, yeah. And they said, well, you got a secondary line between here and the front line. And I said, well, I don't know where it's at. And they told me, well, we don't know either. You'll have to find out. So we had passwords back then, and that password for that night was hallelujah. So it would mean that every about 3 or 4 steps I'd have hallelujah, hallelujah, you know. They probably thought that old boy's a little on the religious side. But after we'd been there a while, to start with, they didn't have no opposition. And then later on, whenever they realized that our Navy wasn't as strong as theirs, then here comes troop transport. And one of them, I remember one time you could see one that they beached up there, men, troops on there, and the ship stayed there. I guess I don't know what happened to them or anything like that. Of course, later on they had lots of battles out there. They call that scrap iron place. There's so many of them. I remember one time on there we had been on a patrol and we didn't see nobody, but we had to spend the night up on some hills up there. And that was the night they had a battle out there. You could see them tracers going long ways just through there, and some of them land. Every once in a while you see a ship go up. And of course, I thought then, I told some of my friends, and they told me too, well, we won in that war, but we found out we didn't win it. The Australians lost 2 cruisers out there at one time, and we lost a bunch of ships out there. That's the reason they call it the scrap iron out there, where all them ships had sunk. And we never had no tents. We had what they call pup tents, I guess, little 2-man tents or something like that. On Cape Gloucester, everybody was given a hammock, and the hammock had mosquito nets on the side of it, and a good top on the top where you wouldn't get wet if it rained. And it rained there. That's, I guess, the monsoon area thing was probably that time of the year or something like that, because it rained. I never seen so much mud in all my life as there was on there. Even the Jeeps got stuck, and that was where the one Jap that surrendered there, that he got. But later on, just before we was able to come back to the States, now my brother, after Cape Gloucester, he got to come home, the one that was mess sergeant. He got to come home, and then he wasn't in the Peleliu. We landed on Peleliu, I think it's sometime in September 44, we landed on Peleliu. Now that was the worst battle that I remember. We didn't get more than 100 yards off the beach the first day. I remember the first night we stayed there, we set up switchboard, and well, we didn't set up no switchboard because there wasn't no place to run no lines or anything like that. But the communication section was what was in telephone, that outfit, was right by a Japanese tank, a disabled Jap tank, and there was a Japanese body laying there, just half of it, from the top half. I don't know where the other half was. But then the next day, I think we got over to the blockhouse. That was a big old house that was just made with concrete, had probably about 75 by 40 or something like that, and it had probably about 24-inch sides in it, all built concrete, and I got to be in the communications telephone section about the time we went to Cape Gloucester, and whenever I was instructed to set up a switchboard in one of those blockhouses there, and that battalion that I was in, they used that blockhouse there they got it cleaned out, some of it cleaned out. Well, they used it for sick bay, and we had our switchboard set up in there, and I had to clean out a place there because the battleships had put some 16-inch shells through that thing, and there's a hole there that you could throw a barrel through, and it. So that busted concrete was on the floor there, so I had to clean up that. And whenever I run across something kind of soft, I raised it up, and it was a hand. And so, but when we was going up there to that blockhouse, well, there was a tank trap there that, I don't know, it was probably about 18 foot wide and about 5 or 6 foot deep. That was to keep the tanks from going through it. And we went up that thing, and then going up to the blockhouse out of it. Well, there was so many Marine bodies there that you couldn't hardly walk without stepping on them. Then one day I had to, while I was there, they wanted me to run a telephone line up to the companies on the front line, and I did. I run a telephone line up there, and whenever I got up there and installed the line, well, then we didn't have no communications. I said, well, I don't know what happened to the line, but the circuit is not completed, you know, and I followed it on back, and I found out that a mortar shell had landed on that line, and so I had to put it back together, and I started to put it together, and then I said, well, I better get over here and ditch or something like that. And sure enough, I was in that ditch putting that line back together, and a mortar shell landed just where the other one did. So I would have been bad shape. We was on reserve most of the time on Guadalcanal, and after we'd been on there about a month, well, they come up there and wanted a runner for a message center. And I said, well, we ain't doing a thing. I think I'll be one. Ain't nobody ever outrun me at school. And so I did. Well, the runner didn't run. I don't know why they had that. But that runner for message center, usually a yardbird's job, you know. But it got me into communications before it's all over with, because Lieutenant Fisher, he was a nice feller. I think he was from Georgia or someplace, but he asked me one day if I would like to be a telephone man. I said, yeah. Of course, that got me in trouble later on, because you know, whenever the war was over, and it wasn't over, but it was whenever we come back to the States and we're back in Quantico, Virginia, they wanted a man to go seagoing. I don't know if you know what a seagoing is. There's a lot of ships that have 2 or 3 or 4 Marines on it. They call it seagoing. And just about all the ships has Marines on it, but there's not a bunch of them on it. They just, they call them seagoing bellhops, because they always, now they have a blue dress uniform, you know, and really I never did see a dress Marine as long as I was in the service, because I never knew anybody that had a dress uniform except one fella that I knew, and I never did see him dress. He wanted to sell me his uniform, but I didn't buy it. But you see, once I got in communication, well, you didn't go to the front line unless you was a radio man or strung a line to the front line, or you had a telephone, radio, and I don't know if there's any other communication in there. I don't remember any other, but you had a bunch of communications section there. You about 40 or 50 men in that. And of course, somebody might say, well, he went through the war and he wound up at PFC, you wouldn't have won. Well, in the communications, you only allowed so many in television, the radio and telephone, so many sergeants, so many corporals, and as long as you got them you have to get one killed or transferred before you can give anybody a rating. And that's the way it was. And of course, whenever I asked they wanted to volunteer PFC to go seagoing, well, I volunteered too, but then they come up there a few days later and said, you got a communication warrant, you can't be seagoing. Well, I was board a ship that was in dry dock there, see, so I hadn't been on the board yet. I mean, that's what you call a board, but you hadn't really got on it because it's dry dock. But anyway, they finally wound up saying, "Well, you're going to Camp Lejeune for further training." Well, we went to Camp Lejeune, and the day that I went down there, I heard people talking about it. He died today, and finally I asked somebody, I said, "Who in the world died?" He said, "Roosevelt died." So that's the day that he died, was the day that I went to Camp Lejeune for further training. Well, I didn't get no further training down there, unless you call it working in a mess hall or something like that. And there was a fellow named Charlie Loshon. I have the picture of him. He and a fellow named James or John Lewis was message center runners from Able Company. And so when I got back to Camp Lejeune after Roosevelt died, well, old Loshon, he was there too, and he told me, he said, "Old Lewis is up there. He's a golf pro, and he's running the country campus I'm at the golf course here." And Loshon wanted to know if I wanted to play golf, and I said, "Yeah, let's go." So that's the first time I ever played in the golf. It was while at Camp Lejeune, the golf course there, and that's the first time I ever lived in a barracks. In December we left down there, and we boarded ships going to Australia, and we got at Brisbane, and we was told that that's where we was going, but we had some people there to get off there and do some asking and one thing and another like that, and they got back on the ship and said, we're not going to get off here because they got more mosquitoes here than they got on Guadalcanal. And so we finally wound up in Melbourne, Australia, which is a beautiful city. You got treated real good there. The only thing they didn't have was good coffee. And we were in the cricket grounds. That was right there. You could walk from the downtown Melbourne out to the cricket ground in about 30 minutes. So it was not far away. But I liked it myself. And my brother, he went back there after the war and married a girl. And of course, he's dead now. But when we left Australia, we went to Goodenough Island. And then after Cape Gloucester, we went to a place called Pavuvu Island. It was in the Solomon Group, but it was kind of a retreat, you know. And the places where we set up our 6-man tents there was in the coconut grove. And the coconuts, them and the hulls that come off of it just scattered the ground, and they had nothing but rats and mosquitoes and one thing another like that. So you had to clean all that place up. And then you had some of the limbs on the coconut trees that was dead and fixing to fall and one thing another. And some of those, all the telephone men had hooks on there that you put on your thing, and you stick them in the tree and climb it, you know. And so we got a workout going up in coconut trees and trying to knock some of the coconuts out to keep them from falling on you. And those limbs that was dead, I don't know, I don't call them limbs, but but that was one of the things. It just is all, and that's the first time that that we ever had in the beer while I was in the Marine Corps was on that island there, Pavuvu Island. They come over there and they had probably a shipload of beer, and everybody I think got about a half a case of beer. About one time you get drunk. Well, Pelledu we caught a President lines out of Pelledu coming back to the States. That was in part of 45, and I come back to San Diego, and we got transportation back. We got I think a 30-day leave, and the report to Quantico, Virginia when it was over with, and of course we went through that about getting wanting a volunteer to go seagoing and one thing, and when I went from there down to the day that Roosevelt died, I was going back to Camp Lejeune, and when I got there, we went through basic training and mess halls and everything like that, and golf courses, and we headed to Camp Pendleton, California, and was there when the bombs was fixing to go back overseas. When the bombs dropped on Japan over the atomic bombs, and so from there, when they signed a treaty, well then they were ready to release us, and so they gave me I think about $100 and told me to go home.
From dawn to setting.